Imagine if you lived in a world where you were constantly watched. A world where everything is controlled by the elite, where you're bombarded with non-stop propaganda. A world where everyone is repressed, lonely, and isolated, existing as one insignificant cog in an incomprehensible machine. This is the chilling vision of the future that George Orwell put forward in his masterpiece, 1984. And does it sound familiar? It's no coincidence that his predictions have come true in nearly every single way in our modern society today. But this concept of a world founded on fiction isn't something that Orwell created all by himself. Instead, this is something that's very real and has been observed throughout history. Thousands of years ago, Plato wrote some of the first recorded philosophy on this concept through what he called the noble lie, where people know their place in society through their belief in an entirely fictional story about the society's origin. The details aren't important so long as it gives justification for the social order. And this gives people a reason to accept how the world is and that their equal man is somehow better or worse than him. And we see this today when our own version of Big Brothers is one thing and then means another. Like when the establishment media, politicians, and World Economic Forum claim to be working for freedom and free speech, all while doing everything they can to bully and censor all criticism into silence. And there are just countless examples of this, like when the fattest, most grotesque politicians of them all claim that they're promoting health. And this concept has evolved over time as people realize that all of society's institutions are built upon a necessary fiction. And this is known as the habitus. It's the veil you need to see through for society to make sense. Now, the concept is similar to the noble lie, but the habitus goes much deeper. You see, throughout your life, you were influenced by your environment and your interactions with other people. And these combined with your personality create your view of the world. And it's in this way that you buy into the habitus, the shared societal illusion of how the world should be. You are socialized into the habitus. It's come down from above and everyone else around you believes in it. The habitus is the social contract between you, your fellow man, and the government. And it's what determines your culture. It's what determines all the societal trends around you, and therefore also decides the rules of society. And this stretches to everything. Our ideas of beauty, what's seen as valuable, what's seen as even right and wrong. But because it's influenced by the environment and how people treat each other, the habitus is always changing to reflect this. And the world of 1984 operates on a habitus. The problem with the 1984 habitus is that it's been cracked to the top and severely deformed. And because it's been poisoned at the top, it's trickled down into all elements of society. And this is why 1984 is so scary. In fact, 1984 is far more unsettling than any dumb horror film because it's so realistic. We all instinctively know what the future could be like because we're so close to it today. Our society that we live in right now is just a few steps away from totalitarianism, and Orwell was trying to warn us of all of this. But this is happening all over the West. When anyone who speaks out against the agenda set in place by Western governments, they are then often censored or bullied into silence. Whether it be Julian Assange or Edward Snowden talking about the government's crimes, or any other supposed thought criminal who's being canceled on social media for talking about COVID and its origins. Anything deemed a thought crime and you can be canceled immediately. I mean, it's gotten to the point now where FBI and other government intelligence agencies are infiltrating and working in conjunction with all the big social media sites. And once they have control of sites like Twitter, they can then censor any narrative they don't like, shadow banning or completely deleting people from the sites. But it's not just social media companies. Now even companies like Uber, PayPal, and even Airbnb can ban you for having the wrong opinions online. And then over in China is their infamous social credit system. The basic idea is for each person to be assigned a personal score based on how trustworthy they are according to the Chinese government. Certain things can increase your score, like making a social media post praising the government. But on the other hand, things like getting into debt, buying too many video games, reading the Bible, or criticizing the government deducts points from your score. And if your score falls too low, the CCP will then severely reduce your already restricted freedoms. as people with a low score can have trouble buying train or even plane tickets. Some people have even had their pets taken away from them, with one student even being denied a place at university because his father had a low score. For now, the system has only been put into practice by some scattered regional governments, but it won't be that way for very long. And recently, it's usually being pushed through new laws to lay the groundwork, meaning that a nationwide social credit system is just a few years away. Recently it's gotten so bad in China that a new law just passed, which means that farmers can only plant the crops the government approves of. And the personal planting of vegetables like beans, melons, squashes in your front or backyard is now strictly forbidden. And in the West, we're also seeing a gradual progression of repression, which is exactly what George Orwell feared. The normal parts of life, which the party sees as a threat to their authority and therefore it's outlawed. It's part of the tactic of keeping the people impoverished and uneducated, as this makes them far easier to control. Because real education and economic prosperity are the two worst things for Big Brother, as they're not trying to enlighten you or save your soul. It's all about control. The more you commit to their ideology, the more they can poison your soul. And that's why in the book Orwell writes, every record has been destroyed or failed. Every book rewritten, every picture repainted, every statue and street building has been renamed, every date has been altered. It's a beautiful thing, the destruction of words. And today in our own world, we're seeing a very similar process unfold. You see things as simple as children's books. I'm talking Roald Dahl books are now being pushed through a demented purity filter, where all bad words or paragraphs are now being rewritten. Words like witches are being turned to hags, fat turned to ginormous, black person to dark, cloud men to cloud people. Entire sections of these children books are being rewritten to eliminate any wrong think. And this isn't just children's books. This is happening throughout all genres. Roald Dahl is just the most egregious example of this, but it doesn't even stop there, because even a recent UK government-backed report has now claimed that reading George Orwell's 1984 is a sign of, quote, extremism. So Western governments are now characterizing people who read 1984 as potential enemies of the state. And this isn't just happening with words, we're also seeing this in the same form of economic control. As we're all familiar with, the past few decades have seen enormous inequality that has steadily risen over the last 40 years, which is why by 2019, the world's richest 26 people earned more wealth than the poorest 50%. But then, after COVID, the biggest wealth transfer in history occurred. Now, to put into scale how big this wealth transfer truly was, we have to look at the stats. In early 2020, before COVID began, billionaires alone as just people owned 2% of total global wealth. And this is only including publicly available information. But just a year later, and this number was now 3.5%. 1.5% more of the total global wealth has gone to just billionaires alone, all in a single year. And the result of this is ginormous wealth for the top elites and a never-ending hamster wheel for the masses, where you can never control your own money, where you never own anything, where you have no property, land or assets, or even any prospect of owning these things in the future. Just continually renting everything with nothing to your name. Because in the last couple years, as wages have stagnated, the cost of everything around you has gone up exponentially, only continuing to go up and up while your income starts to shrink. And so it was no surprise that as this great wealth transfer unfolded, the World Economic Forum unveiled their new plan, the Great Reset. Now, for those of you unaware, the World Economic Forum is a priestly cast of people, mixed up of global leaders, rural families, BlackRock, the world's biggest companies, the biggest banks, the biggest pharmaceutical companies, mainstream media outlets, and the top celebrities. Pretty much a culmination of the world's most powerful people. And these are the people who create agendas and policies that are then adopted by organizations such as the UN, World Bank, IMF, and national governments. And this private organization has no democratic vote. And yet it is quite clearly one of the most powerful organizations the world has ever seen. Not just affecting the West, but also Russia and China. So when they unveiled their plan for a great reset, this marked a new chapter in human history. And the leader of this organization is Klaus Schwab, who claimed the Great Reset would provide a unique window of opportunity to reshape our world. And one part of this agenda was to make the world greener and more carbon neutral. Which sounds great, but what exactly did he mean by this? Well, as you might have noticed, all governments in the West in just the last year have promoted these policies heavily, with the West now being forced to cut their ammonium and nitrogen emissions by 50% alone. However, for many farmers in Europe, their livestock normally produce ammonia, urine, and feces. And so farmers all across Europe were recently forced to cut 30% of their livestock, which meant huge swaths of farmers were forced out of business by the government. And yet these same rules never applied for sectors like the airline industry. So suddenly, farmers and workers across Europe protested. But at first these protests were smeared as just crazy right-wingers. But as this resentment grew and the protests gripped European nations, the government acted harshly, with live rounds being fired upon these protesters. I mean, in the Netherlands, they even changed the law that officers who killed protesters were now immune from manslaughter charges. And whilst the media covered this up, the Dutch government would never receive any backlash, as they were cowing to the World Economic Forum orders. And the working class people in Europe were forced to see their futures destroyed before them, as they were attacked and mocked in the media. And so it was no surprise that around this period, Klaus Schwab, the leader of the World Economic Forum, warned of increasing anger, because Western governments were now forcing the food supply to run dry, whilst artificially inflating the prices amidst a global food shortage, only deepening the economic crisis that the majority of the West were facing. And in an act of doublethink, something that came straight out of 1984, media outlets like Reuters would then claim that there was no evidence that the Dutch government worked with the World Economic Forum to impose these new laws. Which really isn't all that surprising, given the World Economic Forum partnered with Reuters for exclusive content distribution, as the World Economic Forum, otherwise known as Big Brother, controls the flow of information. And whilst you might not see the anger in the news, these protests haven't stopped in Europe. I mean, just recently, protests have gripped the country of France. As the President Macron has risen the pension age, many is going to take longer and longer before workers can ever receive a pension. Even though the majority of France hates this idea, this was imposed anyway, as democracy in Western nations is becoming a facade. In fact, democracies aren't even obeying the people anymore. They obey corporate and financial interests rather than the popular vote. The World Economic Forum over the people. And that's why our freedoms are slowly being stripped economically and socially. Because if everyone had social and economic freedom, then the whole system would collapse. And instead of new parties emerging and addressing these protests, you're now seeing the militarization of the police, more surveillance, more distraction. And it's following this agenda that people like Bill Gates are claiming at the World Economic Forum that during our current worst cost of living crisis and the ongoing fuel shortages, Bill thinks that workers should now also be paying carbon taxes. Or whilst people like Bill Gates are using the most carbon of all, they'll preach things like private property for the average person will be a bygone relic, all while snapping up record amounts of farmland across the US, following their mantra of "you'll own nothing and be happy." And all you're left with is, again, more distraction, more noise, more misery, more tension, and more depression. No more family units, less farms, less freedoms, and no more rights to pursue happiness. And this is just one of the reasons our habitus has been violently shifted towards consumerism and hollow material wealth, because we're being starved of it. And it's the perfect means to keep control in society.